Hey guys, June here, and this video is going to be a two-part guide for the Shattered Worlds minigame. In part 1, we'll be looking at strategies for how to earn the most anima per hour for those of you that want to buy the abilities or slayer masks, and in part 2, we'll talk about pushing to the highest worlds possible for those of you that want to complete the achievements. Getting started right away, if our objective is to farm anima, we're going to employ the strategy of repeatedly rushing the 5 highest worlds where we can consistently complete each of those worlds in under 3 minutes. Doing this causes the player to skip a world each time, and so if done correctly, we'll only end up doing the first, third, and fifth world in any set of 5 worlds. Generally speaking, the comfortable worlds for this tend to be between the 70 to 90 range, however players without access to endgame gear may have to scale that down slightly. In order to accomplish this, we need to focus on 2 primary elements of our strategy. The first is to maximize our AoE damage so that we can clear the mobs as quickly as possible, and the second is to increase our mobility so that we can move through the Shattered Worlds arena more quickly. This is an example of the loadout that I use when I'm farming anima, but a lot of this gear is interchangeable. The first vital part of this setup is the use of a Noxious Scythe or another halberd class weapon like a Dragon Rider lance. Extending our AoE range by 1 using these types of weapons makes it much easier to deal AoE damage against enemies that are using ranged or magic and don't necessarily group up well. The second item of absolute necessity is a Scrimshaw of Vampirism, because these enemies can actually be quite dangerous as we recklessly dive into large groups of them, especially while we're under the effects of Berserk. The next pair of items that make a pretty significant difference are the combination of Weapon Poison and Cinderbane Gauntlets. Not only are these going to just generally increase our outgoing DPS, but most of the time when we go in and decimate large groups of enemies, there's occasionally going to be a few left over on low HP, and rather than wasting our time picking them off one by one, it's much more efficient to move on to the next large group of enemies and let Poison finish off the stragglers. Another important item to bring for those of you who have already unlocked the Bladed Dive ability would be a main hand melee weapon switch to use alongside the Excalibur that I assume you would be bringing anyway, giving us access to Bladed Dive and further increasing our mobility around the arena. Following directly from that, it's also essential that one of your armor pieces has the mobile perk attached to it, giving you twice as much access to those movement abilities as you would otherwise. Apart from these few points of interest, most of the gearing here should be self-explanatory, and although food is not usually an issue, you may want to bring some, as well as a few portents of restoration for some passive healing that doesn't require your direct attention. Before we close out this discussion on gearing, it's worth noting that you can substitute this format with the use of something like mechanized Chinchampas, and although it's a little bit less efficient because of the reduced range on the area of effect, as well as the loss of a few of the mobility abilities, it still can be a reasonably good way of farming anima. Finally, the last thing to talk about before we actually take a look at the gameplay technique is which mutators we should be selecting. The choice of mutators when starting each of these sets of 5 worlds is always the same, and in each of these cases we should be selecting Feeling Pumped to give us basically infinite adrenaline to spam out all of our AoE abilities like Meteor Strike, Hurricane, Quake, all while under the effect of Berserk and really dealing incredible DPS. The mutators that we can select on the worlds thereafter are selected at random, and of those there are only 2 that are actually beneficial to us in a significant way. The first is Charged, and by collecting orbs this basically gives us some more free AoE damage, which of course is simply going to speed up the kills further. The other is called Electric, which gives you a good chance for any damage you deal against one enemy to chain to nearby enemies, which thus amplifies your AoE damage and thus further increases the speed at which you kill the enemies. Apart from these 2, most mutators are going to have either a neutral or negative effect, and it should be self-explanatory which of them is going to be the lesser of evils, assuming you're being forced to make a negative selection. The only mistake that I've occasionally seen is that people who are using the melee technique will sometimes pick the explosive perk thinking, wow, every enemy I kill is going to explode and deal damage to nearby enemies, and that is going to massively increase my AoE damage, which is absolutely true. However, you're also in melee distance, and you are rapidly going to get yourself killed. So this finally brings us into actually executing the technique, and I think that you'll find that it's remarkably simple. When the world is actually generated, the enemies spawn in small discrete groups which are perfect for dealing with our AoE effects. All we really need to do is move into the first group of enemies and spam out things like Meteor Strike, Hurricane, Quake, and Cleave to deal good AoE DPS, and then use the abilities Barge, Surge, or Bladed Dive to move rapidly between those groups of enemies. Remember that we only need to clear 3/4 of the enemies in order to progress to the next world, so usually it's not worth taking on enemies one by one. Simply moving between the large groups, you'll generally find that by the time you reach the portal, you've already cleared enough enemies to move on. You can even get a bit more advanced with this strategy by leaving the occasional enemy alive to be able to use for Barge to backtrack towards the portal later on. Here's an example summary from a relatively casual 80 to 85 run that I did in testing for this video. It's certainly possible to go faster than this, but even at this rate I'm earning about 60 mil anima per hour, and so it would only take a little over 2 hours to earn both of the abilities, or I could alternatively spend it on Slayer lamps and earn about 680k Slayer XP per hour, which is a surprisingly competitive rate, especially when balanced against the fact that this is arguably one of the best ways to train melee. You could even further increase the overall efficiency of doing this by adding the scavenging perk to one of your armor pieces, as this is one of the greatest places to farm components. Overall, this has to be one of the most efficient things that you can actually do with your time, especially if you were to include things like Silverhawk boots on top of it to include an agility training element, and I would certainly encourage all of you to give it a shot and see how easy it really is. This brings us to the second half of this guide, where our objective is going to be to push to the highest worlds possible, and here we're going to run across two major issues as we progress. The first is that as enemies' defense increases from world to world, your hit chance gets lower and lower, and around the world 150 or so it becomes really inconvenient to try to just kill them using conventional strategies. The second issue is that enemies start to hurt a lot, and it quickly becomes impossible to dive into large groups of enemies with soul split and survive for longer than a second. This section of the video is less going to be about a guide, since all we're actually doing is killing the enemies and moving on, and more a collection of tips and tricks for bypassing some of these issues. Here are a few example loadouts just in case you need some direction, however these are definitely adjustable to suit your means. The range setup here is quite a bit more effective for pushing worlds, and that will become more obvious when we talk about the actual strategies we're going to employ, but these should give you a nice set of guidelines to get yourself geared up. Mutator selection is also going to become more and more important to the strategy as we make progress. Just like with the Anima farming strategy, Feeling Pumped is likely going to be our first choice of mutator, and Charged and Electric are both wonderfully effective as well. Unlike with the Anima farming strategy though, we're not going to be in melee distance when pushing worlds, and so Explosive is a much safer and very effective mutator to use as well. Again, like before, most of the other mutators are either useless or have a negative effect, and so assuming you're being forced to make a selection that doesn't include one of these four, it should be relatively common sense which is the least detrimental. That's enough of wasting time on the setup. Let's take a look at some of the actual strategies, and the first tip is to abuse the huge attack range on the Noxious Longbow. The 9-space attack range on this weapon is larger than any of the attack ranges of the enemies within Shattered Worlds, and so you can abuse hit and run strategies or safe spot enemies to kill them off with effectively no danger. This technique is the first of the two reasons why ranged is so much more effective for pushing worlds. Tip number 2 is to make the most out of the hit chance buffs on things like ultimate abilities, special attacks, and when using Nightmare Gauntlets, the snipe ability, which of course is the second reason that ranged is a better choice for pushing worlds. Even if our base hit chance is 0, ultimate abilities gain a 25% hit chance buff, and so since we have Feeling Pumped anyway, there's no reason not to spam them out, and things like Onslaught in particular can be very effective for taking down single enemies. Tip number 3 involves using the Charged mutator, and unfortunately this isn't always going to be offered, but because this effect bypasses the hit chance calculation, this is one of the most effective ways to deal DPS against groups of enemies. This clip comes from World 199, where the base hit chance is like 2% or something ridiculous, but simply by grabbing a few of the charged orbs, heading into a group of enemies, and then through the combination of Feeling Pumped and using Acto Armor, spamming out defensive abilities to keep myself alive, I can take down this entire group of enemies in only a few seconds. Finally, the last tip here is a bit of an oddball, but the Uldat Coil is a really useful item when pushing worlds. Although the hit chance from the Uldat Coil also scales down as the enemies increase in defense, because it attacks all of them simultaneously, it is a very effective means of dealing DPS against them. In fact, if you're finding pushing worlds too difficult or you simply don't want to put the effort in, you can just barricade, run into a group of enemies and place the Uldat Coil and then run back to a safe spot. From here you can do something like broad arrows to passively train some skill while you slowly wait for the Uldat Coil to take care of the enemies for you. Obviously, this is by no means a fast way to push worlds, however, when you account for the XP you gain in whatever skill you're training, it is a very efficient method overall. Hopefully this video helps you guys finish off your Shattered Worlds achievements or refine your Anima farming technique just in time for the 50% bonus Anima weekend that's coming up. If you guys have questions or comments, make sure you drop them in the comments section down below. As always, big thanks to my supporters on Patreon for their continued support, to all of you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.